Well, thank you so much, Christine. It's wonderful to be here. And in a sense, to be talking about TTIP in relation to citizenship, democracy and justice, it's actually quite easy to be radical. Because TTIP means the death of citizenship, democracy and justice. And it's sort of an easy starting point, really, for what I have to say. So what I thought I'd do is just go back a tiny bit and to maybe think politically as to what TTIP represents in our current conjuncture in the sort of second decade of the 21st century. Because TTIP really is the revival of the neoliberal capitalist dream, which was at its high point in the mid-1990s. This idea that we can get rid of nation states, we can get rid of any of the trammels, the restraints on capital as it operates around the world, whether through trade or investment. And if you remember those times, there was a feeling that the rise of globalization meant the end of the nation state. This was the premise that was used a lot in a lot of the discourse at that time. But actually, subsequent scholarship recognized that that wasn't actually true. The nation state had remained strong. It had actually remained an active partner with capital in shifting the balance of power. So it wasn't as if the nation state had disappeared. The nation state was still there, but it was actively colluding, collaborating with capital to hand over power to transnational corporations and the financiers behind them. And I thought that the nicest quote I remember reading on this was the French philosopher Etienne Balibar in his book We the Peoples of Europe, who said that the crisis of globalization is the disappearance of the people. And I think that's much more the reality of it. It's not that the state disappeared, but the right of citizens, the right of democratic bodies to hold capital to account. That was what fundamentally disappeared as a result of the high watermark of globalization. And that is absolutely central to the logic of TTIP. And not just TTIP. Not just TTIP or CETA or all of the other trade rules or anything like that. But that, as Fabio said at the beginning today, that is absolutely central to the logic of the European Union itself. And that, I think, is also worthwhile just reflecting on whether or not we want to take this discussion towards the Brexit debate or not. I came to Liverpool this morning on the boat. I was speaking last night in Belfast on another referendum-type panel. And this meant that I was able, on my boat trip, to read Yanis Varoufakis' new book, which is very nice. And even if we disagree, perhaps, with Yanis Varoufakis' rather strange conclusions as a result of all his experiences, the book is brilliant because it really, really closely analyses the development of the European Union, really from an early stage. And he says it was absolutely clear from the beginning that the foundations of the European Union were not as a democratic body representing the views of the people of, or indeed the governments of Europe, but very explicitly as a supreme bureaucratic body which would be staffed by technical experts who would deliver on a particular preordained program. And that program, of course, is the program of the expansion of capitalist interests. So I think it's really well worth, I haven't got to the end of the book, but already it's really well worth recommending because of that very, very detailed way in which he sets out what the European Union programme is about. And following what Fabio said, I think that TTIP is absolutely the best example of what the European Commission certainly sees as the future of Europe. This idea that the people are fundamentally irrelevant to the future and we should leave it up to Brussels and everything will be all right. So I'm just going to look very quickly in respect of all of these three issues: citizenship, democracy and justice, and their relationship to TTIP. The first bit is fairly obvious. What is the role of citizens in TTIP? The role is nothing. And the way they managed to make this happen, of course, is at the beginning of the negotiations, the European Commission slapped a 30-year ban on all public access to the key documents behind TTIP. A 30-year ban. We got the piece of paper which was written by the chief negotiator in Europe to his counterpart in the USA saying, we will do this and we will make it punishable under the European Union laws if anybody leaks these documents. And of course, more than that, we've seen that it was the UK government, the French government, the German government were also originally kept out of the picture. We had meetings with our government officials here in the UK, and they said it's extremely difficult for us to talk to you about TTIP because we don't know what's going on. And these are the representatives of us in the nation state. They said we have actually not been told what's going on. Eventually, they managed to get some form of communication out of the European Commission. But in the wake of the Greenpeace leaks, which you saw last month, where we did for the first time see what was actually currently in the text of some of the chapters which are in formulation, as a result of that, the European Commission has once again restricted access, even by our own government officials, to the serious readouts from each of the negotiating rounds. So what we've had here is we started with a blatantly anti-transparent situation, and it's got worse and worse. And I do think it's really important here to reflect on the fact that it doesn't have to be like that. This idea that, which everybody says, we're in a negotiation, you need to play your cards close to your chest, is nonsense. At the WTO, which for whatever reasons has gone into its own problems, but at the WTO we saw all of the text with the square brackets way in advance. And it was absolutely not as a result of that the talks went into the sand. It really is totally possible to have these things in the open, and let's just reflect. If TTIP was going to be so great for everybody, they would be shouting it from the rooftops. So there's a bit of an obvious thing there. And just finally on this point, I suppose I should sort of declare an interest that when we launched the European Citizens Initiative, which was the thing which we thought we could do under the very, very limited channels open to European citizens to actually query the policies of the European institutions, we launched in July of 2014, I've forgotten that, the ECI on TTIP and CETA, and we were immediately told you can't. There can be no European Citizens Initiative challenging our desire to launch these negotiations. The one tiny little speck of citizen involvement was not open to us because under the rules, all you can do is ask the European Commission to do more of what they were going to do anyway. You can't criticise them. And I'm sure we'll come back to that when we discuss it more. So if the citizenship element has been excluded by virtue of the fact that none of us have been allowed even near the building in which the negotiation is going to take place, let alone see what's being negotiated. The second element in terms of democracy, I think, is perhaps even more scandalous. And this goes to where the heart of TTIP negotiations really are, and that's the principle of deregulation. As you know, been said many, many times, TTIP is not your traditional trade deal which focuses on tariff barriers at the border. TTIP explicitly is about removing the non-tariff barriers, the regulatory barriers, reaching behind the border into our democratic and social spaces. And tariff barriers were already of significant social impact. If you happen to work in one of the industries which were going to be affected by tariff changes, or indeed if you were going to be working in any of the affected industries around it, this was a serious thing. But right at the beginning of the TTIP negotiations, they said, this is going to be reaching into your very lives. This is going to be talking about the standards, the rules, the regulations, which control the environmental standards around where you live. This is about going to be saying what social standards you can expect, what labour rights you can expect, as we heard from Keith Ewing in the previous panel. That's where they started with TTIP, and that's why there was such an uproar about it, because we suddenly saw that all of the rights and the standards that we cherish and we fought for years and years and years are suddenly being redefined as trade barriers for removal. And of course this again goes to the heart of the European Union's own political programme at the moment through its better regulation agenda. The better regulation euphemism, which was taken over from New Labour, of course, when Peter Mandelson was the commissioner in Brussels, that idea that you need to be reducing the burden on business again and again and again so that European capital can be the most competitive in the world. And that whole one-way street of reducing the burdens on business means a gradual erosion of all of our rights. But not only that, because the leaked documents which we saw last month set out quite clearly that they are still hoping to put into TTIP this regulatory cooperation body, which will ensure that in the future US corporations have a standing right to first sight of any new rules or standards which we might want to introduce. And they have to be vetted by the corporations to check that they will not prove any unnecessary burden on business. Now this is outrageous, that our legislatures, our parliaments, ourselves are completely subordinated to the interests of business when it comes to introducing new regulations. And what was also, I thought, revealing in the Greenpeace leaks is that you saw that the US has asked that this power be made retrospective and retroactive. So they're saying, in fact, US corporations are not just going to be looking over the new standards that you want to bring in, raising the minimum wage. What the hell do you think you mean, raising the minimum wage? No, what they're going to be doing is looking backwards and saying, you know, when you did introduce those new regulations on water purity, on air cleanliness or whatever, that was a problem, because what you're doing is you're discriminating against us because we use dirtier forms of that, and therefore it's unacceptable in the new regime. So the third pillar in respect of justice and TTIP, I can deal with fairly swiftly, you'll be glad to know, because we have sort of talked about it a little bit already, and that goes to the heart of the ISDS stuff. And you know, I said, and I think it's really important to remember, the reason that the European Commission changed from its investor-state dispute settlement to its new investment court system was a very distinct political reason. And it's because it knew that it had to have the Social Democrats on side if it's got any hope of pushing TTIP through at the European and indeed at the national level. And the Social Democratic parties had all said, as a result of the pressure from below, that they would not stand the introduction of investor-state powers within TTIP. So when Cecilia Malmström said, here's this new investment court system, what was the first thing that happened? The German Social Democrats, the SPD, came straight out and said, that's the victory we've been hoping for. We held Cecilia Malmström and we said we will not accept ISDS, and so she's now given us a new acronym which is totally different. And it's so different, it's answered all of our questions. Obviously, it's answered none of our questions whatsoever. The same principle remains. But what it did is it allowed Cecilia Malmström the possibility of pressing not just TTIP but also CETA through the European Parliament. And of course, the new Canadian administration, which came in at the end of last year, was very clever about this. Trudeau came in and he said, yes, we will allow the investment court system to be included within CETA because we know that that's the best way of getting it through. If they held to ISDS, the Social Democratic parties would never have been able to sign up to it. So she made this very, very tiny shift, and that's why it's gone through. So I think we need to recognise that. So my final point on all of this is we need to recognise that TTIP and the European Union present a fundamental challenge to our democratic rights, whether it comes to our citizen rights, the rights of justice, the rights of equality before the law, which of course the ISDS or ICS system blow out the water because they create a parallel justice system which is only available to foreign corporations and not to any of us. When we heard the response of Jean-Claude Juncker to the Greek people when they elected Syriza, or indeed the President of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, who said the Greek people's choice should be negated and a new administration should be imposed on them from outside to be able to ensure that the Greek people took the medicine that they deserved. This is the logic of TTIP, which is being played out both in the external commercial relations and in the internal relations of the European Union. And this is the fundamental problem for us, because we can defeat TTIP. I don't think TTIP is dead, because I think that there's an enormous capacity within the European Union to push these things through specifically without reference to the outside world. The Brussels bubble is almost impenetrable from the noise from outside. So they will continue to negotiate it as Rome burns around them. But what I think we have to do is we recognise we defeat TTIP, we defeat CETA, but then we also have to start looking to these fundamental points about who decides the future of Europe. Who decides the future of European trade policy? Who decides the future of European social policy? Who decides the future of European industrial policy? Because all of these things come together in TTIP, in CETA, and in the future programme. And that, I think, is why, totally miles away from the nasty mainstream media discussion of the EU referendum based on closing borders and opening markets, there is a more fundamental challenge about citizenship and democracy within the European Union, and we need to fight that irrespective of what happens on the 23rd of June. So yes, let's defeat TTIP, yes, let's defeat CETA, but let's also start thinking about the positive alternatives and how on earth we can build towards them when we have been excluded from the debate. Thank you.